Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we have an exciting video, and I know I say that all the time, but it's always true, right? We're developing video games, and what's more exciting than that? So today we're going to be installing the CSpect Emulator on an old Windows laptop that I have here. And if you're not familiar with the CSpect Emulator, you should be, because it's a fantastic product that allows us to emulate the ZX Spectrum Next computer. Now, I know we installed the emulator for the ZX Spin development environment in a previous video. However, that emulator only emulates regular Sinclair Spectrum computers. So if we want to emulate a ZX Spectrum Next computer, we need to use another emulator, such as the CSpect Emulator, which I'm going to be installing today. Now, this product was developed by someone named Mike Dailly, and I think it's a very generous thing that he's done, because he's made this product available for anyone to use for free. So if you're a developer wanting to make games or programs, or if you just want to run games inside an emulator, maybe you're waiting on your ZX Spectrum Next actual computer to arrive, or maybe you don't even own a ZX Spectrum Next and you just want to play some games or develop some games or write some programs, and you want them to be compatible with the ZX Spectrum Next, then you can use this fantastic CSpect emulator. Now, I'm going to install it today on my computer and show you how I do it so that we can get it all set up so we can use it. And we're also going to take it for a bit of a test drive and take a look at a few of the features, and we're going to be looking at it a little bit to see how we can use it. And at the end, I'm going to offer a couple of tips to make it a bit more easy for us to use as well. So if that sounds like something that's cool, which it is, let's take a look at it right now. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is download this product, and I'm going to just bring over my browser window here, and if you take a look here, one place we can download this product is from cspect.org, and another place we can download it from is right here, which is dailly.blogspot.com. And as I'm sure you can guess, Dailly is the last name of Mike Dailly, who developed this fantastic tool for us. And before we download this program, I just want to look at something else that I think is worthy of our attention, which is over here, the mikedailly.com link. So let's go and take a look and learn a bit about the guy who developed this product to begin with. So here's his website, and if we take a look here, it shows a lot of information about him and his past and his background. And if we click on this About page here, we can see there's a little introduction about him and his picture. And I'm just going to read this for us. I'm sure you can read it yourself on the screen, but in case you prefer listening than reading, I'll read it for you. And it says, "Welcome, my name is Mike Dailly, and this site is a vain attempt to try and collect all my histories and works under one roof. I have been a game developer for over 30 years. Wow. And during that time, I've been lucky enough to work on some amazing products that have brought joy to millions. On these pages, I hope to try and bring all these works together and document my time in the games industry, from its humble beginnings at DMA Design right through to where I am now, wherever that'll be when I finish." And if he's a game developer, I hope he never finishes, because I'm just starting out and I hope I never finished. Anyway, he goes on to say, "Game development has been my passion since I was a teenager, and that's why we do this, right? Because it's a passion. At least it is for me." So he says he's been doing this since he was a teenager, when at the age of 13 or so, I got my first computer and then never looked back. I've been incredibly lucky to make a living doing what I love, and have met and worked with some very talented individuals, from the original DMA design crowd to some old school coders on my later retro projects. I hope you enjoy it. And I am enjoying his product, so thank you very much, Mike. On behalf of all of the developers who are developing games for the ZX Spectrum Next computer, we all know what a fantastic, useful tool this is, and I just want to say my thanks on behalf of all of us who are using this tool and getting a lot of use and enjoyment out of it. And one cool thing to look at here is this Office tab, where we can actually see these pictures that he has from 1990 that show, I guess, the office he worked in back in 1990. And this looks like probably the coolest workplace I've ever seen. And I would have loved to work in a place like this, developing games for a living. And here's a picture, I guess, of him working on C64 Blood Money. I guess that's a game for the Commodore 64. Who wouldn't want to do this for a living? Well, I guess some people wouldn't, but I do. Anyway, so that's a brief look at Mike Dailly's webpage. Now let's take a look at the product. So to download this product, I'm just going to go back to cspect.org here. So I'm just going to download the latest version here, which is version 2.14.08. And when I click on it, it does nothing. And I've tried to get my web browser to actually download this file, and it won't. So I don't know how to get that working. So what I'm going to do is right click on this file and click on Open Link in Incognito Window, because that seems to work. So if I click back on the search bar up here and press enter, it's going to ask me where to save this zip file. And I'm just going to save it in the download folder, which is where we are right now. So I'll click save. And now my zip file should be saved in my downloads folder. I'm going to close this incognito window and go back to my regular browser and go up to my download folder, which is right here. And here it is right here, CSpect 2.1408. And I'm going to double click on that. And now it's asking me, well, it's showing me the files that are contained within this zip file, but I need to extract them now, right? So I'm going to go up here to extract all and click on this extract all button. And now it's asking me where I want to save all the folders and files that are within that zip file. And I'm going to create actually a new folder for this underneath my NextDev folder. So if I go down here to my C drive and I select the NextDev folder, I'm going to click on new folder and I'm going to title this CSpect, just like that. And so I'll double click on that and click select folder down here. And now it's going to save all the files or extract all the files and folders into this CSpect folder that I've just created. And I'll click extract. And now it's extracting all the files into that folder. I'm not going to speed up this process because it's pretty quick. And there it's done. Now it's opened this folder for me, and here are all the files that are contained within this CSpect folder now. Remember, we're in the NextDev folder, and then under that we have our CSpect folder that contains all these other folders and files we just extracted. So that's pretty simple, right? So this process has a few little bits to it, but it's really not that complicated, and if we just follow it along step by step, it'll be quite easy. So what do we want to do now? Well, the next thing I want to do is actually install a sound driver file that's called openal32.dll. So now I'm going to go to this website here, which is zxspectrumnext.online, and if I scroll down here to where it shows openal32.dll, I'm actually going to click over here on this installer link, where it will ask me where to save the installer file, and I'm just going to save this again in my download folder by clicking save. And now here it is down here, and if I click on it, it takes me to that folder, and here's the exe file, which is an executable file, as I'm sure you know. So I'll double click on this oalinst.exe file. And it opens up this window that asks me if I wanted to allow to make changes on my device, which I do, so I'll click yes. And now it's asking me to agree to this license agreement, and I'll click OK. Installation complete, so that's pretty easy as well. So now we've installed our sound driver. Now there's one more thing we need to do, which is to download some files again from this zxspectrumnext.online site. And if you look down here under the current distro images section, you'll see these are all the images that are the files that make the ZX Spectrum Next computer operate. So we need to download one of these images to let the CSpect emulator act like a ZX Spectrum Next computer. So I'll just click on this top one here, which is the 2 GB option, and it's asking me where to save it. And again, I'll just save it in my downloads folder by clicking save here. And there it is at the bottom. And if I click show in folder, we can see it here at the top, CSpect Next 2 GB.zip. So I'll double click on that, and it shows me the files that are contained within that zip folder. So I'll click extract all up here. It's asking me where to extract it to. And I'm going to extract these into the CSpect folder as well. So I'll click browse here, and I'll go to the C drive, NextDev, CSpect, and I'm going to select this folder to extract those files into this folder as well. And I'll click extract. So now it's extracting those files, and this takes a while because the image file is quite large and it's going to take a while to extract. So I'll just pause the video here and wait for it to extract. So there we are, and it's extracted the files into the CSpect folder. We can see that there's 3 files inside of this zipped file, which are CSpectNext 2 GB image, and then there's these 2 other files as well, ennext.zx.rom and ennext.mmc.rom. So these are the 3 files that we've just extracted into the CSpect folder. And that's all we need to do. So now we have the CSpect emulator installed on our computer, as well as the sound driver that we downloaded and installed as well as the image for the ZX Spectrum Next computer, as well as these 2 other files. So that wasn't too difficult, and now we're all ready to use our emulator. So how do we use the emulator? Well, there's a few different ways we can use the emulator, and one way we can do it is just by clicking on it directly. So let's go ahead and try it out. So I'll go back to my C drive and my NextDev folder and my CSpect folder. And now if we look in here, there should be a cspect.exe file right here. And if we double click on this file, it should open the program. So Windows is giving me a warning. I'll just click on more info up here and I'll say run anyway. And there we have our CSpect emulator running on our Windows computer. And we can use this just like we would a normal Sinclair computer. So I could type a program here, 10 print hello Circ Live. Although he's no longer with us, which is a shame. Nonetheless, we still get to use his fantastic products he invented. 20 go to 10, of course, and run. So here we have the CSpect emulator installed and running on our Windows computer, but right now it's operating as a regular Sinclair Spectrum computer. But remember, I wanted to emulate a ZX Spectrum Next computer. But before we get into how we do that, let's try something else. So I'm going to press Escape now to close the emulator. And what else do we have in this folder of all these files that were extracted? Well, we have a few demos, and if we take a look at down here, you can see that there are some .nex files. For example, this one here is called modplayer.nex, and we have parallax.nex, and we have beast.nex. So these are ZX Spectrum Next programs that this CSpect emulator can run. So how do we run these .nex files? Well, if we take a look up here, for example, we have a beast.bat file, which BAT stands for batch file. So don't get that confused with a .bas file, which stands for basic file. This isn't a basic program. This is a batch file. And if you don't already know, a batch file is a file that contains instructions for the computer to execute. So I'm just going to single click on this now to get a preview of it over here in our little preview window. So we can take a look at the contents of this batch file. And if you look over here, the contents are a single line of text. And I'm just going to right click on it and select Edit, which will open it up in a larger window for us so we can read it more easily. I'll just zoom in a bit. So there, now we can see that this batch file, when we run it, this is what it's going to do. It's going to execute these commands. So first it's going to run cspect.exe, which is the file that we just ran manually that we know opens up the CSpect emulator in regular Sinclair Spectrum mode. But it also has all these different options listed after it, which might look super confusing, but actually they're not. We're going to figure out what these options do right now. And luckily for us, there's a super easy way to figure out what all these options do, because if we look at the files in this CSpect folder again, we can see down at the bottom here, there's a readme.txt file. So let's just double click on that to open it. And here you can see the text file is open now. And let's just take a look at this first of all. And if we take a look down here, it shows more information about how to install it and some other information about it and so forth. And right at the top here, it says command line options right here. And these are all the options that we just took a look at in our batch file. So there's our batch file there at the top. And here is our README file at the bottom. So here we have a full screen option. So let's just take a look down here in the README and see what full screen does. Okay, right here, full screen. What does it do? Start up in full screen mode. So when we open the emulator using this batch file, it's going to open the emulator in full screen mode. All right, that's pretty straightforward. What's our next option? Sound. What does sound do? Well, let's take a look here. Sound. Disable sound. So obviously this beast.nex file that we're ultimately going to be taking a look at doesn't contain sound. So that's why this sound option is here, to disable the sound. And what else do we have? We have a W2 option. Okay, let's take a look at W. Well, here's W right here. It says W size, and so the size has been replaced with the number 2, and this sets the window size from 1 to 4. So this, I don't really understand why the window size would be set as well as the full screen option would be set. I would think that they would both do the same thing by specifying how large the emulation window should be when it opens, but that's okay. I don't need to understand everything right off the bat. Let's just keep going and take a look at what else we have. So we have a 60 option here, which is right here, which puts the emulator into 60 Hertz mode. And up here we have a VSync option, which is right here. And this says sync to display for smoother scrolling when using whatever. So I'm not so concerned about what that does. Let's see what the other options are. Here's an important one, zxnext. What does that do? Well, if we look up at the top here, it's right here, zxnext. It says enable next hardware registers. That's a very important thing, and that's what allows it to emulate some functionality of the ZX Spectrum Next computer. And finally, let's take a look at this option here, which is MMC. And we find it here, MMC equals directory or file. And what this does is enable RST08 usage must provide path to root directory of emulated SD card. So here we can see what all these different options do by just checking this command line options section of the README file. And we don't have to understand what all these options do right off the bat, but some of them are interesting and useful to know. For example, these ones set the speed of the emulator, 7 megahertz, 14 megahertz, 28 megahertz, and so forth. And there's other options that are interesting in here as well. So if you want, you can take a look at these different options and see what they do. But for now, let's just go ahead and try and running this batch file and see what happens. So I'll just go back here to my folder and find our batch file, which is right here, beast.bat. And we can see over here, it contains all the options we just looked at when we opened this batch file. So let's double click on this beast.bat file and see what happens. So now it opens our emulator and it runs this demo, which is, as you probably recognize, Shadow of the Beast. And that looks pretty impressive and pretty cool. I'm just going to press escape to stop that. So that shows us that the emulation is working great and the video looks fantastic. So we've taken a look at two ways that we can open this emulator. One by double clicking on the cspect.exe file, which opens the emulator in regular Sinclair Spectrum mode. Another way is by clicking on a batch file, which has been configured to open a specific .nex file. But another way we can open the emulator is by doing it manually using a command window. So first I want to prepare the instruction that will open the emulator for us. And I'll do that by opening a notepad file here. And I'm just going to type in the commands that I need to open this emulator. So there's my instructions all ready to go. And let's just take a look at what I've done here. And I'll go back to our readme.txt file that shows what all these command line options do. So let's take a look. So my first option I have here is W3. So we took a look at that a bit earlier, which is right here, W size, which will set the window size to 3 when it opens. And then my next option is the zxnext option, which, let's take a look at that. Right at the top here, will enable next hardware registers. And my next option is nextrom, which is the second one down here, which says enable the next ROM, ennext zxrom, and next MMC ROM. So those are the other two files, remember, that we extracted and put into our CSpect folder. So this is going to use those files to help it emulate the ZX Spectrum Next computer. Now my next option is TV, and let's take a look at what that does. So that one's right here, and it says disable the TV shader. So this is a feature of the emulator that kind of makes it look like a regular television with the lines on the screen. So if you put in this TV option, it will disable that. And then the final option up here shows us what ZX Spectrum Next image is going to be opened. So since we downloaded the 2 gigabyte image, I want this CSpect emulator to open using this image as well. So it's going to be emulating ZX Spectrum Next using this 2 gigabyte image that we downloaded. So how do we actually use this instruction line now to open our emulator? Well, the way we do that is by using a command prompt. And how do we open a command prompt? Well, one way to do it is to go down here to the Windows search bar, and I'm in Windows 10, And you can use whatever search bar is in your particular version of Windows and just type CMD, which is short for command, and this command prompt option should show up here. And if I double click on this and we go over to this window that opens, this is a command prompt in the computer where we can actually type in commands. So if you take a look right now, it shows us where we are in the directory structure of the computer. And you don't really need to know how this works if you're not familiar with DOS commands, because we probably won't be using this method for opening programs. But let's just go through it so at least we know how to do it. So here you can see I'm currently in the Birdie folder, which is underneath the users folder on my C drive. But I need to be in my CSpect folder in order to execute this command that I've just prepared. So I'm going to exit out of this folder by typing cd /, and that brings me all the way to the top level of my drive. So now I'll type dir to see what folders I have available to me here. And you can see right here I've got my next dev folder that I created on my C drive. So I'll go into that folder by typing cd, which is short for change directory, and then I'll type next dev. And just in case you're wondering, this isn't case sensitive, so I don't need to capitalize any of the letters here if I don't want to. I'll just press enter here. There, so now you can see I'm in my next dev folder, and if I type dir, which is short for directory, that lists all the stuff in this directory, it shows me that I have one folder, which is right here, the CSpect folder that I created earlier. So I want to go into that folder by typing cd for change directory and then CSpect. So now I'm in the CSpect folder, and if I type dir again, we can see all the files in this CSpect folder, and there should be that cspect.exe file, which we used earlier to run the program. So let's take a look. And it's right here, cspect.exe. So now if I go back to that instruction that I created, which is right here, you can see it starts with cspect.exe. So if I press Control C to copy this line of text and I go back to my terminal window and I press Control V, it pastes it in at the bottom here. And now if I press enter, it should open the CSpect emulator using all these command line options I've chosen. And there it is. So now you can see we get the start screen of the actual ZX Spectrum Next computer, showing us that this CSpect emulator is now actually emulating a ZX Spectrum Next, which is fantastic. And we can take a look at this, and this operates just like a regular ZX Spectrum Next computer. Right? We can take a look at the browser if we want to, take a look at the different folders and files that are contained within this image that we downloaded. So all of these programs and folders and files that we see here, they are contained within that image file, that 2 GB image file that we downloaded from the website. So if we take a look, let's say under this games folder, and we can go into this next folder, and let's say we go into this Lords of Midnight folder now, and oh look, here's another .nex file. So let's run that. I'll just press enter, and there we've got a game running now, the Lords of Midnight, and I'm not sure how to play this, but we can see that our emulator is working and it's running this game, which is great. So I'll press escape now. And that might seem like a complicated way to open this emulator. And of course, once you have this instruction line created, you can just save it and copy and paste it into this command window whenever you want. But instead of using a command window, why don't we create our own batch file like we used when we took a look at that Shadow of the Beast demo. So I'll just close this command window now, and I'll go back to my line of code. And I've got this line of code actually saved in a notepad, and I'm going to save this as a batch file, because that's really all a batch file is just a bunch of text in a notepad window like this that I can save with the .bat extension, and that changes it into a batch file magically. So if I click on File, Save As, and I want to save this, remember, in my CSpect folder. So if you take a look here, I'm in my next dev folder and my CSpect folder underneath that. So that's where I want to be. I want to keep all these files together for now. And I'll just save this as, let's say, run CSpect, and I want to save it as a batch file, remember, so I need to give it a .bat extension, and now I'll click save, and let's give that a try. I'll go to my CSpect folder, and here's the batch file I just created called run cspect.bat, and if I click on it once to get a preview over here, we can see the contents of it, which is the same line I created when I opened the emulator manually in the command window. But let's see if it'll be a little easier to open the emulator now by just double clicking on this batch file. So it opens the command window for us, which is why that black screen opens, because in order to actually open the emulator, it has to go through that command window just like we did manually, but now we don't have to go through it manually anymore because we have our batch file. And there is our emulator ready to go. So I'll just press escape to exit out of this. So now if you want to start creating a program using this CSpect emulator in ZX Spectrum Next mode, all you have to do is double click on this batch file we created, and it'll open the emulator for you, and you're ready to start using it. So here we could start typing a program if we want by just going down to Next Basic, and now we can start typing a program. So I could type again 10, and remember, since we're now in ZX Spectrum Next mode in this emulator, we can't enter keywords using a single key press anymore. We have to actually type them out. So I'm going to type out 10 print. Wow, it works. 20 go to, oh, and I have to type out go to now. Go to 10 and run, which I also have to type in. There we go. So the emulator is working perfectly now. Now obviously we could use this emulator to run existing programs in games if we wanted to, although I haven't actually used it to do that other than trying out these demos. But I know that if we wanted to run, let's say, a basic program that's already been created, that basic program needs to be inserted into the image file that we downloaded. Remember that 2 GB image file, which is right here, CSpect Next 2 GB image. That image file is what contains all these demo programs and folders and files that we just looked at. So if we want to be able to open up this emulator and use the browser to go to a particular folder that contains a particular file we want to run, let's say there's a basic program that we want to run using this emulator, we need to get that basic program into this image file. We can't just put it into our folder on our computer and run it like that. We need to actually get that basic program into this image file. And I haven't actually done that yet, and maybe I'll do a separate video on that if and when I ever figure that out. But I think you actually need to use a utility called hdfmonkey, which allows you to move files in and out of an image like this. I haven't been able to get that working so far, so I'm not going to show you how to do that today, unfortunately. But again, I'm using this emulator, or I'm planning to use this emulator for development purposes. Now let's take a look at another interesting feature of this emulator since we have it ready to go. And I'm just going to open it again by clicking on this batch file I created, which is, where is it? Here, run cspect.bat. There, so the emulator is open now. And let's go take a look at that readme file again and see what else is in there. So we just took a look at these command line options here, which are used for determining the characteristics of the emulator when we first open it. And we went through a few of those. And now there's some other instructions about manual SD card setup and so forth. Well, here's actually an example of how to run the program using a line similar to the one we created. You can see right here where it tells you how to run the program. It shows you the line that we created, or a version of it, that starts with cspect.exe, and then all the command line options here, which is exactly what we use to start the emulator. So we already actually know this part. And actually, if you look right here, it says, I'd also recommend downloading hdfmonkey, which lets you copy files to and from the SD image. So that's what I was mentioning before about, let's say you want to run a basic program. You have to get it into the image file before you can actually navigate to it using the browser inside the ZX Spectrum Next menu of this emulator. So we would use this hdfmonkey utility to allow us to do that. But let's take a look down here and see what else we can find. So here we have a couple interesting sections. This one is labeled General Emulator Keys, and you can use these keys while the emulator is actually running. And if you look here, the escape key quits the emulator, and down here the F5, F6, F7, and F8 keys, for example, determine what speed you're going to be using in the emulator, how fast you want the emulator to be running, because the ZX Spectrum Next computer can run at all these various speeds, ranging from 3.5 megahertz up to 28 megahertz, and this emulator can emulate that as well. The F3 key resets the emulator, so let's try that out. Let's go back to our emulator, and I'll press the F3 key and see if it resets. Yep, it resets. And we'll go back here to our readme.txt, and let's see what else we can do. The F2 key will load an SNA file, so we can also use this emulator to run SNA files, which I think are snapshot files. I haven't actually used the emulator to do that, but if we go to the emulator and press F2, it'll ask us for the location of a .sna file that we want to open. I'm not going to do that right now, so I'll just cancel that. And now let's take a look at a couple tips that are going to make using this emulator a bit easier for us. Now, one of them is this F10 key right here, which says that it toggles key mode. So what does that do? Let's go back to our emulator now. And if I press the F10 key on my keyboard, you can see this message comes up every time I press it, and it goes back and forth between keys in game mode, keys in basic mode, keys in game mode, keys in basic mode. Now what does that do? Well, this changes the action of how some of the keys on the keyboard work. For example, if I go down here into next basic and I enter 10, print, quote, and now let's say I want to print some graphics characters. Well, how do you get into graphics mode on a Sinclair Spectrum computer? You do that by pressing Shift 9. So if I press Shift 9 now, it doesn't go into graphics mode, it just prints a bracket, which is on the 9 key. But if I press F10 and I switch into game mode, and now I press Shift 9, you can see the cursor is now flashing magenta, which means it's in graphics mode. And now I can press the number keys and generate these graphics characters. Now if I press Shift 9 again, that'll take me out of graphics mode and the cursor's flashing blue again. And every time I press Shift 9, it takes me in and out of graphics mode, and you can see the cursor changing from magenta to blue and back again. So when I'm in this game mode, it allows me to, for example, enter graphics mode when I press Shift 9. And now if I press F10 again and go back into basic mode and I press Shift 9, again it prints the bracket for me. So that is a handy thing to know when you're using this emulator, is that the F10 key switches between game mode and basic mode. So if you're having difficulty entering some characters or entering graphics mode, that's probably why. Now I'll just finish off this line by pressing Control P to get my final quote, and I'll press enter, just type run just to see what it does, and there it prints these funny characters for me. So the emulator seems to be working perfectly so far. And there's actually a website here, I'll just bring it over, which is right here, wiki.spectnext.dev CSpect known bugs, and it describes some of the known bugs with the CSpect emulator as of this current time. And you can just go through and read those if you're having any issues using this emulator to perform any particular tasks. But generally this emulator works really well in emulating a ZX Spectrum Next for the most part. So I think it's a fantastic tool for us to use. And let's just move this window back and we'll continue taking a look at this emulator, because there are a couple more features I want to show you. So I've just cleared the basic window here. And one issue that I've seen with this emulator is that sometimes it will tend to repeat a colon character like this when you're typing in a basic program, and you'll have to press a key to stop that. And sometimes I've been able to use the / key to stop that, or you might need to press the delete key or find a key that actually stops that character from repeating. But that's a common issue that I've seen happen, and I'm not sure if it's been fixed yet or not, or if it ever will be, but that's one thing you might run across with this emulator while you're using it. But now let's go back to our README file and take a look at one last feature, which is actually a really exciting feature of this emulator, which is the debugger. So if we take a look at another one of these general emulator keys, we'll see that F1 here enters and exits the debugger. So let's go back to our emulator, and now I'm going to press the F1 key, and that brings up the debugger. And this is a really cool feature, and this is great if you want to do any kind of machine code program or assembly language programming. And you can see down here at the bottom there are all these memory locations, and for example up here you can see address 4000 hexadecimal, and if you wanted to you could even click on these values and change the values of these memory locations. So for example here, memory location 4000 hexadecimal, which you may recognize as being the top left location on the screen, because that's actually where the screen memory is located. So if I click on this memory location and I enter, let's say, FF, now memory location 4000 should contain the value of FF. And in fact, we can just keep going along here, and if I enter FF into all of these memory locations one after the other, by typing FF, and I just keep typing FF over and over again, you can see on our little display window here, which shows the actual screen that's being displayed within the emulator, you can see this black line starting to appear, and I'll just keep typing Fs, because now I'm filling the video memory with the value 255, which represents all of the bits within a byte turned on. So it's giving me this black line on the screen, and I'll just keep pressing Fs, and as I go along it just keeps filling up the screen with these black lines, and I'm just holding down the F key now, and it's filling all these memory locations with 255 values, which is FF in hexadecimal, and that's why we're getting these black lines on the screen. So that's pretty cool. Not only can we use this emulator to create programs and to run programs, but we actually have a debugger built into it that shows us the disassembly of the machine code bytes that are in memory. And you can see at this top window here, it shows us the disassembly or the equivalent instructions for the machine code bytes that are stored in memory. And if you find this really cool and exciting like I do, you can just go back to this readme.txt file, and it shows you all the different keys you can use to use this debugger right down here. F1 exits the debugger, so if I go back and I press F1 again, the debugger has exited, and now I see my display that I entered by modifying all the bytes within the memory. So being able to access the memory directly is really cool. And if I just keep pressing F1, I can pop in and out of this debugger as much as I want to.